Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. Just give a couple of minutes to see because people are still joining very rapidly. Then we will make a start. Whilst we're waiting, I'm just going to pop a little question in the chat for everyone. So it should pop up on your screens. Now, let's see. Why is it doing that? No, that is not what I want to do. There we go. That should be coming up now. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so if you could just answer the question about whether you have ever deposited research into any preprint server before, that would be great. Will give us a taste of everyone's activities before, and I'll start introducing everyone, I think. Okay, so thank you so much everyone for joining us today. We're going to have a presentation from two speakers today all about the new open access policy refresh from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and how the new preprint server that they have built together with us at F1000 will help support that policy. Your videos and microphones are automatically switched off and are disabled, and that is just because we have a really high number of registrants today. So we wanted to make sure everyone wasn't getting too distracted by the chat. However, the Q&A box is open. So if you have any questions at any time throughout the whole presentation, do drop your questions in the Q&A box, which should be situated at the top right next to where the chat box is or should be. And I'll be monitoring that throughout, and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So pop your questions in there, please. The session is being recorded today as well, and the recording will be shared round to you via email after the event and will be uploaded onto YouTube as well. And we'll try to share that link with you as well. So as I said, the title of today's session is the Gates Foundation 2025 Open Access Policy Refresh, introducing VeriXiv. So if you are wondering how on earth you said that word, that's how you say it. So there you go. We'll have 20 minutes of presentations from each of the speakers who I'll introduce now, and then we should have between 30 and 40 minutes for questions and discussions. So first up, we've got Ashley Farley, who is the Senior Officer of Knowledge and Research Services at the Gates Foundation. In this capacity, she leads the Foundation's open access policies, implementation, and associated initiatives. This includes leading the work of Gates Open Research, a transparent and revolutionary publishing platform. Much of her work advocates for knowledge to be a global good. She completed her master's in library and information sciences through the University of Washington's Information School, and she has a deep passion for open access, believing that freely accessible knowledge has the power to improve and save lives. So that's Ashley. Secondly,
Great.
we'll have George. Sorry, hang on, Ashley, it's not your time yet. So second up, our second speaker will be George Cooper. He's a senior associate publisher at F1000, the open publishing platform provider for Gates Open Research. George has worked in academic publishing for over 10 years, managing and developing publications in health sciences, global development, communication studies, cultural heritage, and anthropology. Beyond his role at F1000, George is also completing a PhD at University College London Centre for Publishing, researching political censorship and knowledge equity in scholarly publishing. So I will hand over to Ashley to get us started.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm happy to take you through our open access policy journey. So this year, we're celebrating a decade of open access. Our first open access policy was in all grant agreements beginning in 2015. At that time, it was very much if there was an open access option at the journal, we would pay to make the article open access. And if there wasn't an option, which at the time, many of the so-called high impact journals or many journals didn't have any option, those journals were considered non-compliant. So that's where we started our open access journey. In 2018, we joined Coalition S, so that was more of a global movement of funders, and then we aligned our policy with Plan S in 2021. It was a very interesting time to change a policy during a pandemic, but it was a very good use case of why we were trying to ensure that all of the research we funded was openly available and especially available for reuse. So it was a time where we really saw open access and open science become critical in solving for a major global problem. With Plan S, we changed our routes to compliance as well. So now instead of there being only a paid for open access option, we allowed for sharing of the author accepted manuscripts and repository. So sometimes that's known as the green open access route. So again, kind of moving forward, like what we considered the version of record that we wanted to see available. In 2016, we launched Gates Open Research. That's been one of my favorite projects to work on. I think it's a really interesting publishing model that captures the technology that we have available to us and is kind of where I'd love to see publishing go in the future, which is more of a publish, review, curate model. It's one I think can better keep up with how much volume of papers are published per year, kind of the strain that we're seeing on peer review. I'm sure many of you are well aware of kind of the peer review crisis right now, where we don't have enough people to review, or those that are reviewing are over strained in that activity, which slows down the whole kind of research publishing process. And publish, review, curate gives us an opportunity to think about that process differently. So those were the kind of two iterations of our open access policy. You know, we saw our compliance or our open access output. It did rise steadily over the years, but it's kind of flattened around 85%. So we haven't quite achieved that goal of making sure that all of our research is openly available. And that's something that we think really ties into the values of the foundation overall. And we want to make sure that our funded research is having the broadest impact available. We saw that article processing charges kind of became the predominant way to ensure open access at journals, and we've seen those costs have risen year over year quite drastically. And I think now there's kind of community agreement that APCs are inequitable. Even the most privileged struggle to afford them. Our most expensive one is now over $12,000. We know it does cost to host a journal and have publishing activities, but we know that it doesn't cost $12,000 per article. And we know that then means that many are, we kind of shifted away from the problem that open access was hoping to solve, which was an equity to access research. And now it's becoming an equity problem to be able to publish research. Which is an issue. So we've been, experimenting over the years. We've been trying to lead projects around price transparency, kind of to really understand the situation in ways that we could, mitigate for that. And largely those projects have not been successful. We've seen over the years that the foundation is being asked kind of less and less to pick up the invoice. So grantee authors are finding other ways to publish the version of record, open access, or pay for APCs. But we've been paying more than ever. So it just shows the steep increase in pricing. We have a underlying data requirement. That has always been kind of a lagging compliance issue that we continue trying to improve upon. And throughout all of our experiences around our open access policy and work, we work closely with similar funders. The goal has always been to align policy kind of as much as possible to make it easy on our grantees to be able to understand and comply with policies. And some of the things, that we're involved in, we're still part of Coalition S, we're part of the Open Research Funders Group, and then we're keeping a close eye here in the U.S. For the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy released the Nelson Memo a few years ago, and they should be updating their public access policy for all federally funded research beginning next year. Which will change to immediate open access, which is very similar to our own policy. So this is kind of a decade of our learning, kind of things that we've trial and error, the data that we have to see, where do we want to go, and what are some of the biggest challenges we want to address. So we do feel together we've ignited tangible change in scholarly publishing, but our journey towards equity and knowledge remains unfinished. And as part of our mission to promote equity for all people around the world, we must work towards a more inclusive future in research dissemination. So this is our vision. We want to foster a publishing ecosystem that is both equitable and inclusive. And so we've now implemented a refresh policy to help us achieve that. I would say it's not the end state. I do think it's very important transition period that we want to address and stop the inequitable practice in scholarly publishing. And then we hope to then drive broader change in the field. So this is kind of the first bold step to be able to, I think, really raise awareness to these issues, to stop the activities that continue to perpetrate harms and inequities, and then realize a better, more equitable publishing future. So the policy aims to inspire a cultural shift away from prestige and privilege in publishing to one that champions equity and access above all. So how are we going to start to begin to achieve it? So we have kind of three pillars here and our key objectives for the open access policy refresh. So as in similar iterations, we started very much with the version of record a journal had to be made open access to it can be that, or it can be the author accepted manuscript that's posted somewhere, which we've had varying levels of success to that due to publisher policies, to now requiring a preprint. And this is kind of what I see as like the last version of the article that authors have full control over to make available at their ready with the CC BY license posted on a preprint server of their choice while retaining their copyright. So that's the biggest shift there. And then this allows us, since it doesn't cost reader or author to publish on a preprint server, we are discontinuing support for article processing charges on a per article level. So this means we are no longer requiring that the journal version of record be made open access, which is definitely a very big shift. But as long as a preprint is posted, the rest of the publishing process can happen as you see fit. But we know that that negatively affects fully open access publishers. So that leads us to our third column, which is finding support for new open access business models and infrastructure. And some of this will include emerging models like Diamond Open Access it's been around for a while, but it's really starting to gain the momentum it needs to scale. I'm also heavily involved in the subscribe to open model, which is basically, taking the subscription model that, universities and libraries pay for subscriptions, but if they keep paying in, that content then becomes openly available to anyone globally. So more of a collective action funding model. We just recently announced with Public Library Science, PLOS, we've a partnership with them to help them explore non-APC based models. We'll still cover publishing activities for our grantees there, so you can continue to publish in PLOS journals and not face an APC. So that's one of our first starts of really kind of shifting away from model. But first, we have to stop paying individual article processing charges. And there are ways, of course, you can we have a handout and our guide on our newly refreshed open access website that'll help you instruct and see other options as well if you do publish in a fully open access journal but cannot afford APCs. So with the shift to requiring preprints, it's just kind of a starter of like, what are preprints? So it's the early version of research that's made available typically upon submission to another journal, or really whenever the authors are ready. From the foundation perspective, we are very motivated in having information shared as quickly as possible as it's ready. Which will help us make quicker decisions and be able to tackle problems much more quickly. And yes, they've yet to undergo formal peer review in kind of the traditional peer review journal sense. But then they're then available broad and early for community feedback. I think in the nature of preprints, people are much more attuned to having a critical eye when reading them because they haven't gone through a formal journal peer review. And I think that we've come to rely too much on the traditional peer review process in journals as a quality indicator. There's a lot of research and evidence to show to the contrary. And So that's been part of, all of our discussions as we make this policy shift is still ensuring that there's quality control mechanisms, and VeriXiv is a big part of that. And George will talk more about that. But the value too is they bypass lengthy publishing timelines, so they're ready to be shared when authors are ready for them to be shared, and then they can be posted and accessed in preprint servers with the CC by license. And some of the elements I think really makes preprinting great. Again, that rapidity and researchers being in control and keeping the copyright to their work. We are seeing a shift in citing practices, so researchers can cite and build upon research more quickly. We've seen, funding agencies allow preprints to be included in grant proposals or grant reports. And I think that's especially important for early career researchers that need to demonstrate kind of their early research and impact much more quickly than having to wait months to years for a formal publication. I think they're way that we can start to really have and build the most kind of equitable view of academic publishing that isn't tied necessarily to prestige or high impact journal publishing. And part of that is that preprints are journal agnostic, so the preprint can be evaluated on its own merit and not the title of the journal that it's published in. So what are our kind of top 5 facts that you need to know? As the open access policy publications clause has been in all grant agreements, all grantees that have had a grant since then will be affected by the 2025 policy. And we really do view this as an opportunity for kind of the policy to run in parallel with traditional publishing needs. Like we still understand that the academic incentive system is alive and strong, despite our efforts over the past decade to really change that. It is going to be a very, very hard, long road to change that. So we just want to make sure that the research we fund is openly available and quickly through preprints, and then publishing can happen as needed to still support those career needs while we try to drastically change that system. Compliance is mandatory. We'll continue to follow up on non-compliance as we always have, which we have a good partnership with OA Works, which is a nonprofit that helps us with reporting and follow-up, where basically, you'll be sent an automatic email that says, hey, your article is paywalled. This contradicts with the foundation's policy. Please upload the author accepted manuscript here. So if a preprint is missed or the time of preprinting, or if we find it too late after publication, that's the request, and we try to make it as easy as possible. And once that upload is completed, the policy compliance is checked off. Yeah, we want to make sure that grantees retain their copyright. When publishing in general, there's really no reason to sign over full copyright to publishers. No article processing charges will be supported for submissions that happen beginning in this year. We will continue to cover everything that was submitted to a fully open access journal in 2024, and we know that that'll take some time and tail end to clear through all the submissions of 2024. And then alternative publishing models like the one I mentioned with PLOS are being explored, and those publishers should be ready to help you navigate the system upon submission. And again, trying to reiterate that the policy will not impact where and when grantees can publish their work. We simply mandate there's a preprint version available, which is something that all journals should be allowing. And with that, I will turn it over to George. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashley, and thanks, Kelly, for that introduction as well, and all of you for joining to hear more about the policy refresh and VeriXiv, which I will now tell you about. This new preprint platform that we've developed with the Gates Foundation. I'm just going to check that I have access. Yeah, we've got access to the slides. Excellent. So in this presentation, just to go back one moment, I'm going to tell you about what VeriXiv is, how it works, what's unique about this preprint platform, a brief overview of some of these features that I'm going to introduce, like integrity checks, ethics badging. We'll have a bit of a comparison between VeriXiv and the other preprint servers that are available to you that you can use. And then a summary of author benefits for you as a Gates grantee, either in using VeriXiv specifically, but also in terms of preprinting in general as well. Then we'll wrap up for our Q&A. So to cover the kind of fundamentals of what VeriXiv is, so VeriXiv has been set up, as Ashley's explained, to help researchers to comply with the Gates Foundation's refreshed policy. So we launched this preprint server in August last year, so it's now currently live. You can submit to it, you can access content that's been made available there as well. It has a number of unique features, which I'm going to come back to, but perhaps most important of all, VeriXiv conducts a series of pre-publication checks to support research integrity at the preprint stage. So this includes at least 20 compulsory ethics and integrity checks, which I'm going to break down later in the presentation, as well as some other checks that will apply to all content that are not mandatory to pass, which are called open research checks. And these will be looking at things like the way that data has been handled, whether it's available and it's findable, interoperable, and reusable, along with clear descriptions of methods to support reproducibility and so on. We'll come back to all these later. Over time, each preprint will have some clear labeling so that readers know which checks have been conducted on an article and which have been passed. That will be coming shortly this year. And VeriXiv, just to kind of understand the reasoning, really, it's been designed in this way to try and raise that publication standard of a preprint to ensure that they have legitimacy as a component of the scholarly record, albeit a non-peer-reviewed output. Just trying to raise that standard and ensure a greater level of parity, I suppose, with a journal article, albeit pre-peer review. So let's delve into this in a bit more detail. So this
Sorry,
slide
George,
really...
your slides are not moving forward.
Oh.
I'm still on introducing VeriXiv.
You're still on introducing VeriXiv. So
yeah.
Let's have a go.
There we go.
All good? Excellent.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Okay, so yeah, this slide now breaks down the workflow for VeriXiv, which I'm going to take you through in a bit more detail. So for those of you who are familiar with Gates Open Research, you'll see that it's not very different, the model. It begins with publication of your preprint on VeriXiv, followed by optional post-publication peer review, sorry. Then post-peer review publication in a version of record outlet, the now Gates Open Research, so our linked publishing venue with VeriXiv. Crucially, you have more options at different stages of the process, rather than only one end-to-end route, which you would have with a traditional journal. In this sense, we're operating what Ashley described as a publish, review, curate model. So 3 distinct stages that authors have got the option to engage with to openly disseminate your research. So to break that down a little bit more, the publication part involves submitting your preprint via a single-page submission system. Then as soon as you submit, preprint checks will begin and will be carried out on your preprint to ensure that ethical research and publishing guidelines have been adhered to. There'll be some correspondence with you if we need to check a few details or ask you to provide further information. Once your preprint has passed those checks, a fully typeset version will be published on VeriXiv with a DOI and badges to signify the checks that have been conducted and those that have passed, which we'll come back to. Unlike preprint servers that only host the PDF and some basic metadata, all preprints on VeriXiv will be available in full XML. So far more discoverable, easier to search, better SEO optimization as well. That content will also be automatically indexed in Google Scholar at that point. That's the point when you've got a choice. So you can either leave your preprint on VeriXiv and as a preprint, or if you want to, you can opt to have your preprint reviewed on the platform with the intention of publishing it as the final version of record on Gates Open Research. If you decide to go down that route involving peer review on VeriXiv and publication in Gates Open Research, then expert reviewers will be invited by our editorial colleagues, and their reviews and names, once we receive them, will be published alongside your preprint. You'll be invited to revise based on the comments that you get, and each of those revisions will be tracked. So you'll be able to see the full version history out in the open, along with the reviews that have been collated. Once your preprint passes peer review, it will then be transferred to that version of record outlet. As I said, for now, it be Gates Open Research. The intention is that over time, there will be other options, other publication venues will be linked into VeriXiv that you could transfer that peer-reviewed output to, hence the curate component there. Okay, can you all see that next slide?
Yes, thank you, George.
Yes.
Thanks, Kelly. Thank you. So I just wanted to show you what that looks like, that transfer process. So on the left, we've got a preprint that received the required number of reviews to pass. It went through 3 versions, and they're all linked on VeriXiv. If you scan the QR code, if you've got your phone on you, you can see that. You can see that version history. On the right is the accepted version. So it was that 3rd version of the preprint that passed peer review. And at that stage, it was transferred straight across to Gates Open Research, which is the place that's hosting that kind of reviewed, verified content. Both of those versions are linked together. So that final version of records links back to the version history and the preprint reports as well that are collected on VeriXiv. So one other important feature of VeriXiv is the diversity of article types that we support. And this is the same as Gates Open Research, actually. So the intention is that VeriXiv, like our other publishing platforms, can be used to disseminate outputs from all stages of your research lifecycle. So this could include things like a review article at the beginning of your research, or a study protocol outlining the research that's about to be undertaken. As you develop your methods or some data, you could publish a methods article or a data note. If you're using software, you could publish a software tool article as well, which basically describes the software that's been developed or used, and again, where it can be found if it's been stored in an open repository, for example, like your research data. And then when you get to that later stage in your project, you can publish a full-fledged research article or individual findings as research notes. We will also have another article type coming later this year called policy briefs, which I might come back to later. And we have open letters as well, which could be quite good for those more policy-oriented outputs that have some recommendations for policy coming from a research project. Alongside these various article types, there are a number of additional features that aren't often found on preprint servers, which I'd just like to highlight here. So as I mentioned, all articles are fully typeset, not just the abstract, the full text as well, and available in XML. Alongside that, all figures are embedded in the HTML version of your article and can be individually downloaded as well and accessed. We have some various metrics, graphs and displays along the side, the right of the article, so you can see usage over time, the geographical spread of usage and engagement. There's a commenting tool at the bottom as well, so you can receive a kind of a more informal review or informal comments from people in your scholarly community at the bottom, and that could also inform some of the revisions that take place on the platform. So now to kind of delve a bit more deeply into the checking, so this other unique element of VeriXiv. So all our pre-pub publication checks have been categorized, and to publish a preprint on VeriXiv, all preprints must pass our authorship, publishing ethics, and research integrity checks, which themselves capture about 20 individual checks that I'll come back to shortly. If the preprint passes these 3 categories, it will be badged accordingly with a badge for each one, and it will be published as what we call a verified preprint. Just to say that the kind of icons here are indicative. The final badging will come shortly. You'll be able to see soon on the platform. So those checks are all mandatory. In addition to those, there will be some additional checks that articles will undergo. And as I said earlier, they're going to assess things like whether the author, basically whether the author's demonstrated a commitment to open research principles and transparency and reproducibility, and providing an opportunity really to showcase that commitment. And so there'll be 2 badges to accompany this. One on the left will indicate that an article is both been checked according to these criteria and passed, and then the one on the right, which is grayed out, so indicates that it's been checked but it hasn't passed those checks. Either way, the article would still be published on VeriXiv. So just to summarize all of these checks in one place, in one slide, so you can have a bit more of an idea of what these are. So under authorship, we're checking for things like your right to publish, so whether you've got consent from all the authors to publish your article, grant information, author contributions, whether they're explained clearly, whether you've used that credit taxonomy as well, which we encourage, and also author validity. So again, whether you're eligible to publish on the platform, are you a Gates grantee, and so on. Then we'll be checking for things related to publishing ethics, like whether a public harm assessment was required for the research that you did and whether one has been provided as part of your submission. Again, whether ethical oversight or approval, whether there was a process that was undergone at your institution to approve the research, whether any identifying information can be found in the manuscript that might be compromising for research participants, whether there was a consent procedure for any human data gathering, and if it's a clinical trial, if you've included a clinical trial ID. Under research integrity, this is where we'll start to use a few tools and investigate the content a bit more to see if there's any evidence of image manipulation, whether the language is inclusive, just looking for kind of culturally insensitive or offensive language in the manuscript. Similarity checking to see if there's similarity with any published and peer-reviewed content. And then competing interests, whether they've been declared or not, whether there's any copyright concerns with the content that you included in your article, and also whether generative AI has been used and if that use has been declared. We don't rule it out in all cases, but we just have to understand how that AI was used, and then we can make an assessment of whether that's a legitimate use or not. Then under open research, again, these are the optional checks. So we're looking at reporting guidelines, particularly for systematic reviews, whether they've been provided and followed. So like the PRISMA guidelines, if you're familiar with those. Whether the methods are described to the extent that the study could be reproduced by someone reading the article, and whether the underlying data or code is available and accessible in a repository, essentially. Yes, so that summarizes the checks that we provide. I'd just like to give you some indication of the additional levels of checking that we're doing versus some of the other preprint options that are available to you. It might surprise you actually that a lot of preprint servers do some level of checking, which you can see on the left. So servers like bioRxiv, medRxiv, and arXiv as well. What we're doing is, I guess, delving a little bit more deeply into the content and using a few additional tools as well, just to check for some of those publishing ethics and other kind of concerns that might come up, which you would normally expect to be checked at, I guess, journal publication stage. But we're bringing it earlier on in that process, really, to, as I say, raise the standard of the preprint and get it a bit more closer to the standards that you would expect for a journal article, which will actually make it easier, really, for you to go on and submit and publish in a journal article. And then, as I said, then there's the additional open research checks on the right, which is not something that you see on other preprint servers. Now, given I noticed in the poll that we put up earlier that the majority of the attendees, I think around 75%, have not preprinted before. So on this slide, hopefully this will be useful to you, addressing some of the common concerns that we hear from people who are unfamiliar with preprinting about this way of sharing your research, which I'd just like to kind of delve into briefly before we get to the Q&A. These might recur in the Q&A, so maybe to head off a few now. So the most common one that we get is concern about publishing in a peer-reviewed journal. They might not accept an article that's been preprinted. So this might have been true in the early stages of preprinting, but certainly nowadays, most, if not the very vast majority of mainstream academic journals will have a preprint policy that explicitly allows for the publication of work that's been made available as a preprint. Even if they don't have an explicit policy, we haven't ourselves encountered any constraints for grantees who've used VeriXiv to publish their work elsewhere. And it's, as I say, it's a very common practice now, not just in STM fields, but also in the social sciences. There are a number of social science specific preprint servers, so this is quite a common practice now. Where you might hit a constraint is if you tried to publish an article that's already been published or peer reviewed. That's the crucial constraint that you see in publishing policies. Or if you try and submit an article for publication and peer review in two outlets at the same time. So the first, that's duplicate publication, and then the second is duplicate submission. But neither of those would apply to preprints because preprints are unpeer reviewed. Other common concern is that preprints aren't attached to an impact factor. That the preprint server doesn't have an impact factor, which is true. I mean, we do have various other ways you can measure engagement and impact in terms of those kind of usage metrics I talked about earlier, and alt metrics too. Happy to tell you more about that later. Obviously, there are questions in the publishing and scholarship communities about whether impact factors are really a reliable measure of quality. But really, if this is something that's important to you, publishing your work as a preprint, making it available, doesn't stop you from submitting and publishing in an impact factor journal if you want to, alongside making it available as a preprint. And also in terms of the kind of quality standard of the preprint itself, this is something that we're actively trying to address with these preprint checks that we've just described. So actually there is quite a bit of quality assurance that goes into preparing a preprint for publication. And again, we're trying to make that more publicly known and available through the badging that we provide. Again, this is quite a common one. I get this less nowadays, but yeah, certainly in a lot of the resources you see around preprinting, people are concerned about being scooped, and so that's when someone else basically gets there first and publishes something on a topic that you're working on. So in terms of preprinting, making that more likely to happen, that's really not the case. So if you preprint your work, you're getting in there as quickly as you possibly can. You're getting your name and the date of publication and a persistent identifier out there in the public domain very quickly. You don't have to wait for peer review. So it allows you to, as I say, get in there early and stake a claim to the research topic and the research methods and so on that you're using. So yeah, we would encourage you to preprint to try and counteract actually some of those practices. In terms of a preprint not being peer reviewed, yeah, that is true. It's not necessarily an issue as long as I think that's transparently the case, I think, which it is on VeriXiv. This isn't the final version of Record article, but as I say, it's not to say that we're stopping you from going on to do that, to publish your peer-reviewed outlet. In fact, we actively encourage you to do that. We're not replacing that additional layer of quality assurance. As I say, it's just getting that initial work out there more quickly, and allowing for some early commenting and maybe informal review to take place on the platform as well. And if you want to go down the peer review route on VeriXiv, you can, as we described earlier. So if you've got concerns about your work being out in the public domain, getting public negative comments, I mean, I would highlight, obviously, this isn't just a problem for preprinting, it's a problem of sharing your work generally, say at conferences or in social media or in the public domain. On the whole, what we've found is that open commenting in reviews that aren't anonymous, which is what we provide as part of our platform, far more balanced because they're also subject to public scrutiny. We also moderate the comments that come in at the bottom of the page, and the reviews that are posted. If any bad comments were out there, obviously we screen for that, but it's a kind of general comment. They look bad for the commenter, not for you really, especially if they're not very constructive, if they're a bit unbalanced and just focusing on the flaws. But as I say, particularly with the peer reviews, we do screen those and check them that they adhere to our policies, and on the whole, we find that they are more balanced than a closed peer review would be. And then finally, in terms of this concern that was particularly widespread during the pandemic, actually, the preprints contributing to misinformation. This comes back to how the public really and journalists use preprints. And one way of combating this misuse of preprints, I suppose, as peer-reviewed articles or being lent on, the evidence supported, given in a preprint lent on in the same way as a peer-reviewed article, is to make it, I say, abundantly clear that preprints are pre-peer review. And as currently now on the platform, we do have badges to indicate the level of peer review, like whether it's been submitted to peer review, whether it's undergoing peer review, if the content is not peer reviewed, or indeed if it has gone through that peer review process and it's passed. And that's all out in the open for people to see. It's very clear on the platform, I think. So that's one way that we are addressing that concern. But as I say, I think journalists and particularly journalists reporting on science are far more well-versed in preprinting, particularly since the pandemic. The pandemic really kind of shone a spotlight on preprinting as a practice. And I think journalists understand and handle that type of content better. So finally, I won't run into all these in a huge amount of detail because I'd like to get to the Q&A, but this is a summary of some of the main benefits of preprinting in general and of using VeriXiv. So as I say, it gets your research out there quickly, allows the community to build on your research whilst you're getting ready to have it peer reviewed. You can get established priorities, I mentioned earlier, demonstrates evidence of productivity, which could support your institutional reviews or grant funding applications, avoids duplication or redundancy of people working on projects that are related to each other, just by getting your outputs out there early. It's also the process that we follow is quite an open and iterative process, so people get to see how that research is evolving over time and how your manuscripts are developing. So it's inviting a little bit more public understanding and I suppose scrutiny into the scientific process, which we think is valuable. And then also the process of publishing by VeriXiv, as I mentioned, will actually prepare you and your manuscript for its final destination, hopefully in a peer-reviewed journal of your choice. Thank you. I think at that point, I will hand back to Kelly to introduce the Q&A. Oh, just to say, if you'd like to speak to me about your submission to VeriXiv, if you're working on something, there's a link here to a Calendly booking system, so you could book a call with me. But I'll bring that up again at the end. Yeah.
Thanks, George. Okay, I've just launched another poll, so please do respond to that. But we do have lots of questions coming in, so I will be answering the questions in order of how they are ranked. So please do get ranking if you haven't been already. There should be a little upwards arrow in the bottom left-hand side of each question, so you can bump it up the list there. So firstly, Ashley, this one's coming at you. We are having lots of questions around Gates-funded projects that do not normally publish in academic journals, or projects where their outputs more take the form of briefings or reports that are simply deposited on their project websites. Do these projects now have to deposit this content on VeriXiv as well?
Great question. Overall, no, those would fall outside the scope of the open access policy. But I would say, depending on what the publication form looks like, it might be an option. Same with Gates Open Research. So we didn't talk a lot about this, but one of, I think, the most successful parts about Gates Open Research is actually the non-peer-reviewed side. So we have things called gateways and collections. So if you take a look there, you can see that a lot of our funded work has posted on there, similar to posting on your website. But what I think is great about kind of also posting on Gates Open Research and the non kind of peer-reviewed side, or potentially VeriXiv, is it gives you a DOI, or a digital object identifier, and that can help increase accessibility, discoverability of those outputs. So if it's something that you want to reach a broader audience that you might not already have coming to your site or using those materials, that's an option. We've hosted guides, toolkits, things like that. And then it also ensures that a little bit, I think, increased preservation. So especially for, the foundation having kind of ownership over the platforms, it means that they will, stay around in perpetuity. We have kind of archival setup. So it's not a requirement, but I do think there are a lot of options there that you might be interested in exploring to further accessibility and reach of those types of outputs.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, it's worth bearing in mind as well that the documents on Gates Open Research are also indexed in Google Scholar, so that goes even more to increasing the discoverability of your content. Excellent, thanks Ashley. The other question that we've had a few times is, do we have to use VeriXiv, or can we use another preprint server?
Yeah, great question. You can definitely use another preprint server. But as we've gone through all of the examples George has provided, we do, I think, definitely prefer VeriXiv, and a couple of reasons that we've created it, knowing that there are other options out there. Of course, we want to meet you where you're at. So if you're used to using those preprint servers, please continue to do so. We're also engaged in working with all the other preprint servers to see where we can make improvements, make sure that we're finding those preprints. But one VeriXiv is integrated with our grants management system, which might not seem like a big deal, but it helps us easily verify grant numbers and make connections of the funded research back to the grant that originally funded it. The additional checks, I think, something that we are finding important and wanting to make sure that we have kind of more robust preprint, that we are encouraging kind of best practices in preprinting. And then also we kind of expanded discipline and article types. So we've run into some issues in the past around preprinting or finding a preprint server that will take a certain article type or a certain discipline type. So we wanted to make sure there's an option available for grantees to easily comply no matter kind of what the publication type is that they want to have openly available, or the discipline type. So some preprint servers might have a bit of a scope around that could be a barrier. But then there's things like archive, which is quite broad. So definitely up to you.
Cool, thank you. We then got a lot of questions around, will depositing a preprint on VeriXiv prevent publication in another journal, which I think, George, you kind of spoke at the end of your presentation there to say, no, it shouldn't. But one sort of adaptation on that question was, if my target journal actually does not accept preprints, is there provision for withdrawing the preprint from VeriXiv?
That's an interesting question. It's the first I've seen it. So I'm going to give you my kind of on face value kind of response to that, I suppose, my first response, which is that, if we, let me just find that again. So
if my target journal does not accept preprints, is there a provision for withdrawing the preprint from VeriXiv?
Yeah, so there isn't a formal process for withdrawing based on that reason alone. If there were concerns with the content, like some significant ethical concerns, then the retraction policy kicks in. But we can't allow for authors to withdraw just on that basis alone because of the investments that have been made into the production of the article and so on. But we haven't really come up against any instances where that is the case, where like a journal is actually active in preventing people from publishing preprints subsequently. Obviously, if you come across journals that do have that constraint, we'd really like to hear from you so we understand that better. But as I say, when you come to preprinting, and I think it's important to have an idea of what your target journal is, and if you foresee any constraints in terms of, or if you're not sure about, if it's not clear with that target journal whether that is going to be an issue, that is something you can speak to us about, and we can help to advise as best we can. We'd also encourage you to speak directly to the journal and to the journal editor as well. But as I say, personally, and in the work that we've done around VeriXiv, it's not something that we've come across for those, as I said, the kind of main journals that people tend to publish in the fields that VeriXiv is kind of linked to through Gates funding and so on. But yeah, Kelly, Ashley, I don't know if you've got any other experience.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely echo that. I would certainly want to hear about it, and I realize I didn't put contact information on the slide, but openaccess@gatesfoundation.org. Please always feel free to reach out for any reason, any concern. We're also happy to I always try to encourage grantees before submitting or doing anything, ask us questions, because it'd be much easier to mitigate for issues than at acceptance of an article at a journal or something. It can be very hard to kind of fix things after the fact. But I'd be very interested. We've done kind of extensive research, at least when we set our policy, we look at the top 20 journals in the top 10 publishers that our grantees have historically published in the past 10 years. So of course there's a tail end, but we've done extensive research on preprint policies before we set the policy there. So really it shouldn't be a barrier, but of course things will crop up, and we'd love to hear that and those experiences and do what we can to help mitigate for that. And the other thing I was going to say was, I've lost it. Sorry. But yeah, so we definitely would like to know. I know. But the other thing was that we're also keeping a close eye on publisher policies if those are to change. So it's definitely like part of our risk register of this policy change is, we know at any time. And we've seen that with, we had a strong rights retention strategy for the past 5 years around trying to get the, authors to be able to share their author accepted manuscript openly. And we've seen pretty aggressive publisher reactions to kind of stop that, which is one of the major motivators for us changing our policy the way we have now, because, like I said, preprint is kind of the last article version authors oftentimes might have control over. So we are following closely to see if there are any of those changes, or if we see publishers becoming much more aggressive towards preprints, we will act accordingly.
Mm.
Oh.
I think it's worth adding there as well. A lot of publishers have preprint servers.
Yes,
like
that's it.
mainstream publishers. I'm not going to name them all, but many very large publishers that have very large journal collections also have their own preprint servers. So there would be there's a strong disincentive for them to prohibit printing as well, if that's any reassurance.
Cool. Thank you both. This is somewhat off topic, but you did mention it, Ashley, and lots of people are voting for it. So could you please explain the work that you're doing with PLOS?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So we've recently given a grant to PLOS that it has kind of three main components to it, and this is really kind of the beginning of what we hope to do to help scale up and facilitate alternative models that don't rely on APCs. So, PLOS is a good nonprofit example and partner, and they've been wanting to get away from APCs as well. They've been quite vocal that this is not equitable. They understand that through their own experience with authors globally trying to publish theirs. So it's three components. One, we'll be able to continue to cover Gates funded articles being published there, but we're paying more of a, I like to think of it as kind of like the diamond model start, where we've agreed on kind of a cost for those publications. We'll review it yearly with them, but we're not, authors will not get an individual APC if they publish there with Gates listed as a funder. So that's the big thing. So wanting to make sure grantees know that they can, if they can't afford the APCs themselves, please still publish there. It's an option. Second, we set up a fund. So one of the reasons I feel really passionately about this policy change is we've seen over the past decade how many under or unfunded authors there are globally that reach out to us asking for APC support, that struggled to get waivers. We've seen an increase in even actually well-funded or authors affiliated with well-funded institutions that are struggling to make APC payments. So we will be covering the waivers for unfunded authors in PLOS Global Health. So it's kind of a small way for us to start to kind of pay it forward and make sure that other we're trying to change the equity piece around APCs. So it's one small start there. And then there's a research component around the business models. So helping and seeing that if we can get PLOS to change their entire business model away from relying on article processing chargers, I think that could be a massive game changer in the space. I mean, we do know that there are small publishers and journals that have operated on like the diamond model, so they're kind of subsidized. There's no fees for authors or readers. That's something that the open access community and a lot of funders would really like to see at scale, kind of similarly to how we've always hosted kind of the costs for Gates Open Research. How can we spend about 6 million per year so far on making maybe 2,000 articles open access. I mean, you could technically probably subsidize a global platform of publishing at that cost. So how can we spend that money differently to support not just Gates funded researchers, but any researcher that wants to share their research globally? So that's the project. It just kicked off beginning of this year. I highly recommend, and maybe I can throw the link somewhere, we do have an open access newsletter. So if you want to follow any developments there, that's kind of our main channel for sharing new options for grantees or successes of our work moving forward.
Oh, thank you. Another quick one for you, Ashley. Does this policy apply to sub-grants?
Yes, it does. Every grant has a responsibility to others clause, which then means that the main grant recipient will cascade all policies down to any sub-grantees. And as far as compliance goes, we scrape all of the indexes, and we look for whether or not Gates funding is acknowledged in the paper or is within the metadata. So that's how we track down compliance.
Cool. And then this one goes out to both of you, I think, but I'll go to George first because I feel like I've been neglecting
Thanks.
him. How do you consider the risk on lower quality or false information in preprints which aren't peer reviewed? The peer reviewing process is long and not perfect, but it does provide a warranty on the quality of the information contained in the article.
Yeah, I mean, that almost comes back to part of the answer I was giving earlier. So if we are notified or if we find out of any information that's contained in a preprint that's false and actually ethically problematic because it's false, or likely to be damaging because it's false, then the retraction policy would kick in. And we have corrections policies as well. It wouldn't have to be a full-blown retraction, but we could correct content. And there's a process to follow there. We don't preclude peer reviewing at all. Like, you can go down that peer review on VeriXiv, or obviously you can have a peer reviewed outlet elsewhere, and the two would be linked. What we would also really encourage is if you were to publish a peer reviewed article outside of the kind of VeriXiv system, that it links back to that preprint, and also, you know, you can provide some kind of interlinking between those two versions, so that it's clear that there is another peer-reviewed article out there. What we're doing to try and counteract this, like front and center really at VeriXiv, is to make it abundantly clear, as I said earlier, if an article has been peer-reviewed or not, or what the status is. If it's not, might be on peer review, but it might be undergoing peer review, or there might be some peer review reports available as well. And like I said as well, it's that commenting function, allowing more opportunities for people to actively engage with that earlier output, so you can see what level of discussion is going on there. That can be quite useful for the public and journalists as well, to see that kind of wider debate surrounding an article and make their own assessment really of the quality, some of the issues, and so on, or differences of opinion around a topic. But as I say, if there's something really problematic in an article that could lead to it being misused in quite a dangerous way by the public or media, then that's something that we can address through those policies that I mentioned.
Yeah, I would just add to that the level of checks that the preprints on VeriXiv receive prior to publication on the website are so much more exhaustive and stringent than what you would see on many other preprint servers. So we would like to think that gives, or we do think that gives the preprints that were posted here kind of an extra little seal of approval because they've passed all of our internal checks, similarly to content that gets posted on Gates Open Research and our other platforms. Okay, we're running out of time, so I'll just sort of wrap up, I think. So we have, as I said at the beginning, the recording will be circulated to all registered attendees, and it will also go up on YouTube, so you can share it with anyone who missed it. So thank you very much. And with regards to all the questions that we didn't get to answer, we'll definitely collate them all, and maybe we can put it up in a blog on Gates Open Research or something. Yeah, I'm seeing nods.
Great.
Okay, we'll do that. So we'll get those out to you soon. I would say if you have a question about your specific project and whether you need to publish this or how you could publish it on VeriXiv, do just scan that QR code and book in a meeting with George, or drop us an email and have a chat to one of us. We're more than happy to chat to you about your specific requirements and see whether you can make use of VeriXiv in that way. We do also have 2 forthcoming webinars. So if you'd like to find out more about VeriXiv from the author's perspective, we have a webinar coming up on the 12th of March where one of our early adopters will come and speak to you about what it was like to publish their content on the platform as well. And then we'll have another webinar in May. So please keep your eyes peeled on Twitter, I guess, and to see the times and registration links for those new ones. Otherwise, thank you so much for attending, everyone. And thank you, George and Ashley, for taking the time to present to everyone. And yeah, keep your eyes peeled on the blog for the answers to the unanswered questions so far.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very
Have a
much.
great rest of your day.